Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through time and the sacred waters of the Amazon. Today I bring you a story that transcends eras, an impossible romance that flourished on the banks of the Rio Negro, where two worlds met and transformed each other forever. Between the steam of the rubber plantations and the perfume of wildflowers, we'll discover that true love knows no boundaries of color, class, or culture. Where are you watching us from today? Tell us in the comments your city, your corner of Brazil or the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that special like. Your company makes this journey even more magical. Manaus, 1898. Pulsating heart of the Amazon, where the green gold of rubber transforms men into kings and dreams into reality. The most impossible romance of the Amazon. The waters of the Rio Negro flowed gently beneath the golden mist of evening, carrying in their depths the secrets of the ancestral forest. The steamboat Esperança cut through the mirrored surface, its noble wooden hull groaning softly against the current, while Colonel Augusto Vasconcelos observed the shore through the lace curtains that adorned his private cabin. At 42 years old, Augusto was the embodiment of power in the Amazon. His hands, once calloused from work, now bore golden rings that reflected his rise from poor rubber tapper to rubber baron. The white linen jacket, impeccably tailored, couldn't hide the melancholy that dwelt in his brown eyes, as if all the wealth in the world couldn't fill the void that grew in his chest with each expedition. The perfume of jasmine and sandalwood that permeated his clothes mingled with the humid aroma of the jungle, creating an olfactory symphony that awakened in him an inexplicable nostalgia. Nostalgia for something he had never lost, but always sought. It was then, when the sun kissed the horizon painting the sky in shades of amber and coral, that his eyes captured an inert form on the sandy shore. A female figure, motionless as stones polished by time, lay among the twisted roots of a centennial saber tree. "Stop the steamboat," ordered Augusto, his voice cutting through the air like the sharp blade of a rubber tapper's knife. She was there, unconscious, her bronzed skin contrasting with the wet fabrics that clung to her body like a second skin. Hair black as the Amazonian night spread across the golden sand, adorned with small feathers and beads that spoke of an origin that the salons of Manaus would never understand. The ritual scars on her arms formed intricate designs, narrating stories of pain and resistance that only the initiated could decipher. Augusto descended from the steamboat with the urgency of one who finds lost treasure. His steps sank into the soft sand as he knelt beside the stranger, feeling for the first time in years his heart accelerate for something beyond business and contracts. Upon lifting her in his arms, Augusto perceived the surprising lightness of that body that seemed to contain the strength of the entire forest. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he could feel the wild perfume that emanated from her hair, a mixture of sacred herbs, morning rain, and something indefinable that awakened sensations in him that had been dormant for decades. On the steamboat, while she remained unconscious in his cabin, Augusto observed every detail of that face that seemed sculpted by the forest gods themselves. Her lips, though pale, held a curve that suggested both sweetness and pride. The closed eyelids trembled like butterflies about to take flight, and he wondered what color the eyes hiding behind them would be. When she finally awakened, it was as if the Amazon itself had opened its eyes. Dark irises, like the deep water of the Rio Negro, looked at him with an intensity that left him breathless. For a moment, time and space seemed suspended, as if the entire universe had been reduced to that meeting of gazes. Then, without warning, she spat in his face. The warm liquid trickled down Augusto's face as she rose with the agility of a jaguar, the scars on her arms glinting under the light of the kerosene lamp. When she spoke, her voice had the roughness of sandpaper and the music of rain on foliage. "I would have preferred to die rather than owe my life to a white man." The words echoed in the cabin like precise arrows, piercing all the defenses that Augusto had built over the years. He wiped his face slowly, without anger, only with a curiosity that grew like high tide. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice came out hoarser than he intended. "Yara," she replied, her chin raised in defiance. "And you are the one who steals the tears from the rubber tree to fill his coffers with blood." Augusto felt something move in his chest, a mixture of admiration and disturbance that he hadn't experienced since youth. That woman, stripped of everything except her dignity, possessed a wealth he could never buy or conquer. How could an indigenous woman banished from her own tribe awaken such intense feelings in the most powerful man of the Amazon. And what would be the price that both would have to pay for this encounter of destiny? The full moon poured its silver light over Manaus when Augusto led Yara through the cobblestone streets that echoed their steps like distant drums. The city bustled with rubber wealth. European palaces rose among colonial constructions, and the Amazon theatre shone like a jewel set in the heart of the jungle. But Yara walked oblivious to all opulence, her bare feet touching the stones with the reverence of one who treads on sacred ground. The clothes that Augusto had provided, a white cotton dress embroidered with golden threads, seemed out of place on her body, accustomed to the freedom of traditional loincloths. "Why did you bring me to this stone prison?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of one who knew the vastness of the forest. Augusto stopped before the wrought iron gates that protected his mansion, watching how the light from the gas lamps danced on her face. Because I simply can't let you go," he confessed, surprising himself with the brutal honesty of his words. Augusto's house was a testament to his social ascension: French furniture, Persian carpets, bohemian crystals that captured and fragmented light like prisms. But when Yara crossed the threshold, it was as if all that magnificence paled before her wild presence. In the days that followed, the mansion transformed into a silent stage where two cultures observed each other like cautious animals. Yara refused to sleep in the canopied bed that Augusto had prepared, preferring the cold floor of the terrace, where she could contemplate the stars and whisper prayers in her ancestral tongue. It was during these nocturnal vigils that memories tormented her like insistent ghosts. 3 moons before Wai, in the lands of the Tikuna, Yara had been the promise of a noble lineage. Daughter of shaman White Vulture, she had grown up among the secrets of ancestral medicine and the sacred stories that linked her people to the primordial forces of nature. Her hands knew the power to heal wounds, with herbs that grew only in the rainy season, and her eyes could read the omens written in the flight of birds. But Yara's heart beat out of sync with her people's traditions. When Tupa Durado, the young and proud chief, asked for her hand following millenary rituals, she dared to do the unthinkable. She refused. "Marriage is like the river," Tupa had said, trying to bend her resistance. "It must follow its natural course, without obstacles." "And I am like the waterfall," Yara replied, her eyes sparkling with a determination that disturbed even the elders. "I prefer to shatter on the rocks than follow a course I did not choose." The rejection resonated through the village like the cry of a wounded Wirapuru. The older women whispered that spirits had possessed the young woman, infecting her with the madness of the whites who came ever closer, bringing their diseases and greed. The banishment ritual was conducted under a new moon that hid its face in shame. Yara remained motionless, while the shaman drew with urukum the marks that would separate her forever from her people. Each stroke on the skin burned like red-hot iron, but she didn't shed a single tear. "You chose the path of the serpent," said her father, his voice breaking like dry branch. "Now you will crawl alone until you find your own death." And so Yara departed, carrying only the clothes on her body and the ancestral knowledge that no banishment could erase. For weeks she wandered through the forest, feeding on wild fruits and sleeping in treetops, until exhaustion overcame her on the banks of the Rio Negro. Back in the present, in Augusto's mansion, Yara observed through Venetian glass windows the impeccably pruned gardens that reproduced an artificial paradise. Each imported rose, each geometrically trimmed hedge, spoke of a control that nature had never known. "You transformed living earth into a beautiful cemetery," she said one morning, when Augusto found her in the garden. "It's civilization," he replied, but the word sounded hollow in his own mouth. "Civilization is a disease that kills the soul of the earth," Yara replied, her hands delicately touching a young ipe that grew forgotten in a corner. "You don't love nature. You violate it, and then call the result progress." Augusto felt those words like arrows that found targets he didn't know he possessed. He had spent decades building his empire on forest exploitation, justifying every felled tree, every polluted river as necessary steps toward the future. But when he watched Yara interact with the plants, the way she whispered to wilted flowers and they seemed to straighten under her touch, how her hands found medicinal herbs where he only saw weeds, he began to question whether the future he had built wasn't actually an impoverished past. It was on an afternoon of torrential rain that the first miracle occurred. The caretaker's son, an 8-year-old boy, had fallen from a mango tree and lay unconscious, with a high fever that no doctor in the city could break. Augusto had called the best doctors in Manaus, but they shook their heads in despair. Yara approached the boy without asking permission. Her hands moved over the feverish little body like birds in ritual dance, while she sang a melody that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. She mixed herbs that she gathered from the mansion's own garden, plants that Augusto didn't even know existed there, and prepared a tea that smelled like forest after rain. In 3 hours, the fever broke. In 6, the boy opened his eyes. In 12, he was running through the hallways as if nothing had happened. The news spread among the rubber workers like fire in dry grass. Yara, the mysterious indigenous woman who lived in the boss's house, possessed the gift of healing. But for the elite of Manaus, that was seen as dangerous witchcraft. "You're harboring a sorceress," said Doña Eulalia, wife of Augusto's greatest rival in the rubber business, during a casual encounter at the club. "People are already whispering that she brought curses from the forest." Augusto felt his fists clench involuntarily. "She saved a life," he replied, trying to keep his voice controlled. "She threatens our social order," Doña Eulalia retorted, adjusting her ostrich feather fan. "An indigenous woman in your quarters is scandal enough. An indigenous woman with powers is unacceptable." That night, when Augusto found Yara on the terrace contemplating the stars, he realized she had heard the entire conversation. "Do you regret having saved me?" she asked without looking at him. Augusto approached slowly, like one approaching a wild animal. "Never," he replied, and for the first time since finding her, his voice came out firm and clear. But while the connection between them deepened like roots in fertile soil, powerful forces began to mobilize to separate those two worlds that destiny insisted on uniting. What price would Augusto be willing to pay to protect a woman that his own society considered a threat? Dawn arrived, tinged with red over the rubber plantations, as if the very sky bled in omen. Augusto rode among the rows of trees that were his source of wealth, watching the rubber workers begin another day of labor that extracted both the precious latex and the life from men who came from all parts of Brazil in search of fortune. The morning air carried the sweet perfume of sap mixed with the workers' sweat, creating an olfactory symphony that Augusto knew better than any European perfume. But that morning something disturbed the usual harmony, a murmur of discontent that spread among the men like sea breeze before a storm. "Boss," called Benedicto, the trusted foreman, approaching with a troubled expression. "The men are restless. They speak of bad luck since the indigenous woman arrived." Augusto felt his jaw tense. What kind of bad luck? The trees are producing less. Some say she cursed the rubber plantations. Others tell stories of apparitions in the forest, of voices calling during dawn. "Superstitions," Augusto cut short, but his own voice sounded less convincing than he intended. It was then that the scream echoed through the forest, a primitive sound that froze the blood of all present. In the eastern plantation, where the oldest trees grew in mysterious circles, an accident had transformed the golden morning into a red nightmare. The wooden bridge that connected the collection platforms had collapsed, taking with it 15 men who fell 20 meters. Augusto arrived at the scene to find bodies scattered among the trunks like broken dolls, while survivors groaned in agony. The company doctor, Dr. Alcantara, shook his head in despair. "There's nothing I can do, Colonel. The fractures are multiple, some have internal bleeding. We'd need a complete hospital, and even then..." That's when Yara appeared. She had followed the sound of desperation through the forest, moving among the trees with the fluidity of one who knows every secret of the jungle. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for authorization, simply knelt beside the first injured man and began to work. Her hands moved as if they possessed their own life, touching specific points on the wounded bodies, while her lips whispered songs in ancestral tongue. From the forest floor she gathered mosses and lichens that no one else had noticed, chewed roots until extracting their healing juices, and prepared poultices with a precision that left the doctor himself speechless. "This is impossible," murmured Dr. Alcantara, watching how the bleeding began to stop. "Medicine doesn't explain." "Not everything needs explanation," Yara replied, without lifting her eyes from her work. "Some things just need to be accepted." For 8 hours she worked without rest. She set broken bones with splints made of bamboo and vines, prepared natural painkillers that relieved pain better than any imported morphine, and brought back to life men who already had one foot in the other world. When she finished, she was exhausted, her hands stained with blood and earth, but all 15 injured men breathed peacefully. In the following days they would recover completely, without after effects, as if the accident had never happened. The rubber workers looked at Yara with a mixture of reverence and fear. For them, she had transformed from possible witch to forest angel. But for Augusto, who had watched every movement, every delicate gesture of those hands that saved lives where Western medicine failed, she had become something even more dangerous, a woman he was hopelessly in love with. That night, when he found Yara washing her hands in the stream that ran behind the mansion, Augusto couldn't contain the words that hammered in his chest any longer. "How did you learn to do this?" he asked, sitting on the bank beside her. "My people have known the secrets of healing for 1,000 years, Yara replied, watching the muddy water carry away the last traces of blood. "You, white men, believe that wisdom comes from books written in distant cities. We know it springs from the earth itself. Teach me," said Augusto, and the urgency in his voice surprised them both. Yara raised her eyes to look at him, and for the first time since they met, Augusto saw something different in those dark depths. Not hostility, but curiosity. "Why would a man who possesses everything want to learn from a woman who lost everything?" she asked. "Because," Augusto hesitated, struggling to find words that would express the turmoil he felt in his chest. "Because seeing you heal those men today, I realized that all my wealth isn't worth a single life saved by your hands." The silence that followed was filled only by the murmur of the stream and the distant song of Yara Purus. Yara studied Augusto's face as if trying to decipher an unknown language. "Healing is not a technique that can be learned," she said finally. "It's a gift one is born with, but compassion, that can be cultivated like any seed." "Then teach me to have compassion," Augusto pleaded, extending his hand to touch hers in the flowing water. When their fingers met in the cold current, both felt an electric current that had nothing supernatural, but everything profoundly human. It was the first true touch between them, the first moment when barriers began to dissolve like sugar in rain. "There is a price," Yara whispered, without withdrawing her hand. "Any price," Augusto replied. "You'll have to look inside your own soul and face all the shadows you find there. You'll have to confront every life you destroyed to build your empire. Are you prepared for that?" Augusto felt the weight of all his past decisions collapse upon him like an avalanche. How many centennial trees had he ordered cut down? How many rivers had he polluted with the waste from his factories? How many men had he exploited to exhaustion in the name of profit? "No," he confessed, his voice breaking like dry branch, "but I want to be." And so, in the dark waters of a stream lost in the forest, two destinies began to intertwine irreversibly. But while Augusto struggled to transform himself into the man Yara deserved, dark forces conspired to destroy that connection that threatened the established order. How much time would they have before the world around them discovered that love had flourished where there should have been only impossibility? The Grand Opera of Manaus sparkled like a terrestrial constellation under the starry dome of the Amazonian night. Baccarat crystals captured and multiplied the light of 1,000 candles, while French silk and Italian velvet adorned the walls of the theatre that was the pride of the rubber elite. It was the night of the most important social event of the year, the Golden Rubber Ball, where fortunes were displayed and political alliances woven between Viennese waltzes. Augusto adjusted his black silk tie for the 10th time while waiting in the Carrara marble hall. His tuxedo, cut by Paris's finest tailor, contrasted with the anxiety that hammered in his temples like indigenous drums. He had made a decision that Manaus society would never forgive, bringing Yara to the ball. When she descended the mahogany staircase, Augusto's world stopped spinning. Yara wore a midnight blue satin dress that had arrived from Paris on the last steamboat, every curve enhanced by golden embroidery that recalled the constellations she loved so much. Her hair, normally loose in the wind, was gathered in an elegant chignon adorned with hummingbird feathers and small diamonds that captured light like drops of morning dew. But it was her eyes that impressed most, that wild depth now framed by a defiant gleam that made her simultaneously a queen and a warrior. "You are magnificent," Augusto whispered, offering her his arm. "I'm wearing the costume that you whites demand to accept us in your rituals," Yara replied, but her voice carried a playful note that Augusto didn't expect. The silence that greeted them when they entered the main salon was deafening. 400 pairs of eyes turned toward them like spotlights, and Augusto could feel the murmur that spread through the assembly, like waves in a tranquil lake. Feather fans trembled more rapidly, monocles were adjusted with surgical precision, and social smiles froze into porcelain masks. Doña Eulalia Camargo, wife of Augusto's greatest rival, was the first to approach, her pink taffeta dress rustling like dry leaves. "Colonel Vasconcelos," she said, her voice sweet as poisonous honey. "What an interesting surprise you've brought us." "Allow me to present Miss Yara," said Augusto, keeping his voice steady despite the storm he felt forming. "Miss?" echoed Doña Mercedes Santos, appearing beside the first like a vulture scenting carrion. "What charming family you must have, dear. Which Santos family from which region?" Yara raised her chin with the hauteur of a princess. "My family are the eagles that fly over the mountains and the serpents that know the secrets of the earth. My surname was written by the wind on ceiba leaves long before you knew this land existed." A glacial silence descended over the group. The ladies exchanged glances loaded with scandal and satisfaction. Finally, they had ammunition to destroy the reputation of Manaus's most powerful man. "How poetic," said Doña Eulalia, her smile sharp as a blade. "And tell me, dear, where did you learn to speak our language with such fluency?" "From the same missionaries who taught your daughters that God created hierarchies among men," Yara replied, causing another seismic tremor in the group. Augusto felt pride and terror in equal proportions. Yara wasn't just surviving the attack of the social serpents, she was confronting them with the cunning of an experienced huntress. The orchestra began to play a waltz, and couples formed in the center of the salon like pieces in an elaborate game. Augusto extended his hand to Yara, who accepted it with the grace of one who had always known how to dance, though she had never set foot in a ballroom. And how they danced. Yara moved as if the music were a river, and she a canoe that knew every current. Her steps followed the rhythm with a naturalness that made it clear that rhythm lived in her blood long before any European teacher was born. Augusto lost himself in the dance, forgot the audience, forgot protocols, forgot everything except the woman in his arms who transformed a simple waltz into sacred ritual. When the music ceased, the applause was polite but cold. It was then that Clara Camargo, Doña Eulalia's daughter and known for her beauty and cruelty in equal doses, decided to deliver the fatal blow. "How lovely that costume you're wearing," she said, approaching with the smile of a vengeful angel. "It must have cost a fortune to domesticate a savage, to make her look like civilized people." The insult echoed through the salon like cannon fire. Conversation ceased. Glasses stopped in mid-air. Even the orchestra lost its rhythm for an instant. Augusto felt blood boil in his veins, but before he could react, Yara stepped forward. "Thank you for the compliment," she said, her voice softer than morning breeze. Really, managing to appear civilized when surrounded by such present examples of refined barbarism requires great effort. Clara paled as if she had been slapped. "How dare you?" "I dare because, unlike you, who paint cruelty with social varnish, I don't hide my nature," Yara continued, raising her voice so all could hear. "You call my ancestors animals, but they were the ones who taught the first whites to survive in this land. They were the ones who showed where to find food, water, medicines, and you paid them with disease, slavery, and death." "This is a scandal," shouted Doña Mercedes. "I won't allow this." "This woman," Yara completed. "Person? Human being? What word are you looking for, madam?" The confrontation had attracted all present, like a magnet attracts iron. Augusto realized they had reached a point of no return. Either he defended Yara publicly, sealing his social ostracism, or abandoned her to preserve his position. There was no possible choice. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Augusto, raising his voice to echo throughout the salon, "allow me to clarify something that should be obvious to any educated person. Miss Yara speaks Portuguese, French, and English perfectly, knows natural medicine better than our doctors trained in Europe, and possesses a dignity that many of you would do well to learn. Are you defending an indigenous woman against society itself?" asked the Baron of Manicore, his voice loaded with incredulity and threat. "I'm defending an extraordinary woman against ignorance," Augusto replied, offering his arm to Yara. "And if this disturbs some present, I suggest they examine their own consciences." They left the theater under a silence that weighed like molten lead, but Augusto had never felt lighter in his entire life. In the carriage that took them back to the mansion, Yara remained silent, watching the cobblestone streets through the window. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally. "The only thing I regret," said Augusto, taking her gloved hand, "is having taken so long to find you." But while the carriage cut through the Amazonian night, carrying two hearts that were beginning to beat in unison, the echoes of scandal from the theater were already spreading through the city like fire in dry grass. And in the shadows, Powerful enemies began plotting to destroy a love that threatened the very structure of Manaus society. The first rains of the season arrived with unusual violence, as if the very heavens wept tears of fury. For 3 days, Manaus disappeared under veils of water that transformed streets into rivers and gardens into swamps. The Rio Negro rose beyond its usual limits, swallowing the docks and invading warehouses where rubber awaited shipment to Europe. It was during this storm that he appeared. Shaman White Vulture emerged in the central plaza like an ancestral apparition, immune to the rain that ran down his skin, painted with urucum and juniper without ever washing it away. He brought with him the smell of the deep forest, humus, tree blood, herbs that grew only where sunlight never touched. His eyes, small and bright like those of the bird that lent him his name, swept the European constructions with the contempt of one observing a profanation. "Where is the lost daughter?" he asked the first curious onlookers who approached, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. The news spread through the city faster than the flood itself. Yara's father had come to find her, and brought with him curses that were already manifesting in the fury of the elements. In the mansion, Augusto found Yara on the terrace, allowing the rain to wash her face while she watched the horizon where forest met sky. She had felt her father's presence even before he set foot in the city, an ancestral connection that no distance could break. "He came to find me," she said without turning, her voice almost lost in the storm's noise. "Do you want to go?" Augusto asked, approaching slowly. "What I want stopped mattering the moment I accepted banishment," Yara replied, "but he didn't come from nostalgia. He came from fear." "Fear of what?" Yara finally turned, and Augusto saw tears mix with rainwater on her face. "That I brought imbalance to the spirit world, that my presence here is causing the gods' wrath." As if Yara's words had invoked a divine response, thunder resonated over the city with force that made the window glass tremble. At the same instant, one of the rubber workers burst onto the terrace, soaked and desperate. "Colonel," he shouted over the rain's noise, "the plantations. Something terrible is happening." What Augusto found in the rubber plantations surpassed any rational explanation. The rubber trees, which for decades had produced abundant latex, had begun to weep blood, a red viscous sap that flowed from the cuts like tears of pain. The workers, superstitious by nature, refused to touch the trees, whispering about curses and revenge of the forest spirits. "I've never seen anything like it," murmured Benedicto, the foreman, looking at the trees as if they were wounded creatures. "It's as if they were suffering," but it was more than that. During the night, strange phenomena began to haunt the camps. Men awakened speaking in tongues they had never learned. Women's voices echoed through the forest, calling ancestral names, and some workers swore they had seen indigenous children playing among the trees, only to discover nothing was there when they approached. Panic spread like an epidemic. In 1 week, half the rubber workers had abandoned the camps, preferring poverty to remaining in lands they considered cursed. Rubber production plummeted, contracts were cancelled, and Augusto's rivals began circulating rumors that he had allied with supernatural forces. "You need to get rid of the indigenous woman," said João Antonio Pereira, Augusto's minor partner, during an emergency meeting. "The men believe she brought the curse. As long as she's here, no one will work." "She saved lives," Augusto replied, but his voice sounded less convincing than he would like. "And now she's destroying fortunes," Pereira retorted. "Be practical, Augusto. One woman isn't worth an empire." That night, Augusto found Yara in the garden, kneeling before the only rubber tree that grew on the mansion grounds. Her hands touched the tree's bark as if it were wounded skin, and she sang an ancestral melody that seemed to calm the storm around. "It's my fault," she said without raising her eyes. "My father is right. I brought imbalance." "No," said Augusto, kneeling beside her in the wet grass. "The imbalance already existed. You just made it visible. The trees are dying because of me. The trees are dying because we spent decades torturing them for greed. What's happening now? Perhaps it's just the bill coming due." Yara raised her eyes to look at him, and Augusto saw in them a depth of pain that made him understand, for the first time, the real weight of loving someone from a different world. "You lost everything because of me," she whispered. "No," said Augusto, taking her hands in his. "I found everything because of you." It was then that he said the words that changed everything between them. "I love you, Yara. I love your strength, your wisdom, your courage. I love the way you see the world and the way you make me see the world. And if loving you means facing 1,000 curses, then let them all come at once." Yara closed her eyes as if the words were physical pain. When she opened them again, Augusto saw there not only love but also terror. "I love you too," she confessed, her voice breaking like a branch in the storm. "And this is the greatest sin I've ever committed, because our love is a bridge built over an abyss, and I don't know if it will withstand the weight of two worlds trying to destroy it." The kiss that followed was wet with rain and salty with tears, but carried all the urgency of two hearts that had finally found their truth, even knowing that truth could be their destruction. At the same moment, without their knowledge, Shaman White Vulture raised his painted staff to the sky and intoned a chant that echoed through the night like a war cry. The battle for the destinies of Augusto and Yara was just beginning. And while the storm intensified around the mansion, two souls discovered that true love is simultaneously the greatest blessing and the greatest curse that the gods can grant to mortals. But would that love manage to survive the ancestral forces that conspired to separate them forever? Dawn brought news that cut the morning air like poisoned blades. Augusto awakened to Benedicto's desperate knocking on his library door, where he had spent the night in vigil, watching Yara sleep peacefully in the leather chair before the fireplace. "Colonel," the foreman's voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. "Telegrams have arrived from London and Hamburg. The contracts, all have been cancelled." The words echoed through the environment, heavy with the jasmine perfume that emanated from Yara's hair, creating a bitter contrast between the beauty of the moment and the cruelty of reality. Augusto took the papers with hands that tried to disguise their trembling, reading line by line the polite justifications that masked pure prejudice. "Due to extraordinary circumstances and concerns about production stability," said the first. "Social order issues that affect company reliability," echoed the second. The news had crossed the ocean faster than any steamboat. The Manaus elite, wounded in their pride at the ball, had moved their European influences like pieces on a cruel chessboard. In a single night, Augusto's rubber empire had begun to crumble. "How much time do we have?" he asked, folding the telegrams with surgical precision. "With the cancellations, perhaps 3 months before we need to close the first plantations," Benedicto replied, avoiding looking at Yara, who had awakened and watched the scene in silence. Yara rose from the chair like a gazelle sensing danger, moving to the window where morning light revealed the first boats leaving port, rubber workers who preferred to try their luck in other lands rather than remain in a place they considered cursed. "How many men left during the night?" she asked without turning. 57, Benedicto admitted reluctantly. "And how many plan to leave today?" 100 more, perhaps 150. Augusto felt the world spin around him like a leaf carried by current. In less than a week, he had lost million-dollar contracts and half his workforce. The murmur about curses and omens had transformed into mass exodus. "I need to leave," said Yara, her voice cutting through silence like a knife through silk. "No," Augusto replied, with a firmness that surprised even himself. "You don't understand," she turned, and her eyes carried a sadness deep as artesian wells. "My presence is destroying everything you built. Every day I remain here, more men leave, more contracts are cancelled, more your life crumbles." "My life began the day I found you," said Augusto, approaching her with slow, deliberate steps. "Everything I built before that was just preparation." "Preparation for what? To lose everything? To find something worth more than everything?" Yara closed her eyes, as if the words were physical blows. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't understand the price you'll have to pay." "Then explain it to me," said Augusto, taking her hands in his. "Make me understand." It was then that Yara told him about the ancestral prophecies, the stories her people had kept for generations about what happened when two worlds touched through love. She spoke of jealous gods who punished audacious mortals, of curses that spread like wildfire, of the price the forest collected from those who defied natural laws. "My people believe each person is born with a destiny traced by the spirits," she explained, words flowing like spring water. "When someone tries to flee that destiny, the entire world becomes unbalanced. And I fled twice. First when I refused my marriage to Tupa, then when I fell in love with you." "What if the spirits are wrong?" Augusto asked. "What if our destiny was exactly this, to find each other and love each other? Then why is everything around us crumbling?" The question hung in the air like incense in sacred ritual, without easy answer or possible consolation. Augusto knew she was right. Her presence had become the epicenter of a storm that threatened to destroy everything he had built. But he also knew, with the certainty of one who had touched the absolute, that he preferred to lose all his fortune rather than lose that woman. During the days that followed, the situation deteriorated like fruit abandoned in the sun. More workers left, carrying with them stories of apparitions and omens that spread through riverside cities like spiritual epidemic. The few who remained did so only out of personal loyalty to Augusto, but even they whispered prayers when they thought they weren't being observed. It was on an afternoon of heavy skies that the most devastating news arrived. A horseback messenger, covered with road dust, brought words that made Augusto's blood freeze in his veins. "Colonel, federal troops are heading to Manaus. Imperial government order to investigate. Public order disturbances." The Manaus elite had moved their political influences. Yara was no longer just a social scandal. She had become a matter of national security. The Brazilian government, always fearful of indigenous revolts, saw in Augusto's passion a possible spark that could ignite the entire Amazon. That night, when Augusto found Yara in the garden contemplating stars she knew as intimate friends, both knew they had reached a definitive crossroads. "They're going to take me," she said simply, "and you won't be able to stop it." "I can try," Augusto replied, but his voice carried more desperation than conviction. "And then? Will we spend the rest of our lives fleeing? Will you abandon everything you are to live hidden like a criminal?" Augusto didn't respond immediately. He observed her face bathed in the moon's silver light, memorizing every detail like one who knows he's living the last moments of happiness that will be granted to him. "I prefer a lifetime fleeing with you," he said finally, "to an eternity of safety without you." And so, while the stars witnessed the desperation of two lovers who had defied the laws of their worlds, the forces that would conspire to separate them approached like rising tide, inexorable and devastating. But would their love be strong enough to resist not only social prejudice, but also the implacable power of an empire that tolerated no challenges to its order? The discovery came like lightning on a cloudless night, devastating in seconds the fragile happiness that Augusto and Yara had built. She was organizing his documents in the library, a domestic intimacy that made them feel like a true couple, when she found, hidden among commercial contracts, a worn leather folder that exhaled time's bitter smell. Inside, yellowed photographs and handwritten reports told a story that made Yara's blood freeze in her veins like stream water in winter. The images showed indigenous capture expeditions carried out 2 decades before, when Augusto was still an ambitious young man who followed orders from more powerful colonels. There he was, younger and with eyes that didn't yet know compassion, beside armed men who posed proudly before groups of chained indigenous people. The reports, written in his own hand, detailed cold numbers that represented destroyed lives. Captured 47 specimens of the Ticuna tribe. Destination: Alto Juruá rubber plantations. Among the listed names, Yara found one that made her heart stop. Yara Ticuna chief, approximately 40 years old, killed during resistance. Yara was the name of her most beloved uncle, her father's younger brother, the man who had taught her to identify medicinal plants and read messages written in birds' flight, a gentle man who told ancient stories with honeyed voice and laughter that sounded like distant waterfalls, a man who had disappeared when she was 12, leaving only her family's inconsolable pain, and whispered stories about people hunters who came from the city. The photographs trembled in her hands like leaves in a storm. In one of them, she could recognize other familiar faces, cousins, childhood friends, people who had simply disappeared over the years, leaving only suspicions and laments. There they all were, reduced to numbers in commercial reports, human merchandise destined for forced labor in rubber plantations. And Augusto. Augusto was in every photograph, directing those expeditions as if they were wild animal hunts. The paper fell from her hands when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. Augusto entered the library, whistling a waltz they had danced the previous night, carrying 2 cups of herbal tea she herself had prepared. The smile died on his lips when he saw the expression on Yara's face. "What happened?" he asked, but his eyes had already found the documents scattered on the floor. "Yara," said Yara, her voice emerging like a ghost's whisper. "You killed Yara." The silence that followed was dense as morning mist. Augusto set the cups on the table with imperceptibly trembling hands, his eyes fixed on the floor as if there he could find words to explain the inexplicable. "Yara," he began, but she raised her hand to silence him. "He was my uncle," she continued. each word cutting the air like glass shards. The man who taught me that all forest creatures were sacred, who told me the first stories about water spirits, who carried me on his shoulders when I was too small to follow the long walks. Augusto felt the world crumble around him more devastatingly than any financial crisis. I didn't know. In those days I was— What? Yara's voice rose like a harpy's scream. Different? Young? Ignorant? You can see his face in the photographs. You can see the fear in the children's eyes. Didn't that tell you anything? I followed orders, said Augusto, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. It was a different world. I was 20 years old. I didn't question— You didn't question chaining human beings like animals? You didn't question separating families? You didn't question killing? Yara rose like a wounded beast, her eyes sparkling with a fury Augusto had never imagined possible. She took one of the photographs and raised it before him like an accusation. This man here, she said, pointing to a young Indigenous man who had his arm around a child, was Kawan, my mother's cousin. He had a 5-year-old daughter who cried for him for months. And this one, she pointed to another face, was Raoni, who made the most beautiful fishing nets in the entire tribe. He had just married. Each name she pronounced was like a stab to Augusto's heart. He observed those faces he had reduced to numbers, trying to remember human details he had deliberately ignored at the time. They weren't just Indigenous people to be captured, Yara continued, tears of rage running down her face. They were fathers, sons, husbands, storytellers, healers, artists. They were people. I know, Augusto whispered, feeling smaller than an ant before the magnitude of pain he had caused. I know that now. Now, Yara threw the photograph against his chest. After falling in love with one of them, how convenient your moral epiphany. Augusto let the photograph fall to the floor, not trying to defend himself because he knew there was no possible defense. He had participated in those expeditions with the coldness of one who saw Indigenous people as obstacles to progress, resources to be exploited, subhumans who didn't deserve moral consideration. You're right, he said, his voice broken like a branch in the storm. I was a monster. You may not believe it, but every day since then I carry the weight of what I did. Every day I look in the mirror and see a man who needs to spend the rest of his life trying to compensate for unforgivable crimes. Compensate? Yara laughed, but it was bitter laughter like quinine bark. How do you compensate a life? How do you compensate a childhood without a father? How do you compensate the terror of a child being torn from his mother's arms? You don't compensate, Augusto admitted. You only dedicate each remaining day to trying to be someone better than you were. Yara looked at him, as if he were a stranger, as if she was seeing him for the first time. All love, all tenderness that had flourished between them seemed to have evaporated like dew under merciless sun. I fell in love with the man who saved my life, she said, her voice cold as mountain current. Not with the murderer who destroyed my family. I am both, Augusto replied, extending his hand in desperate plea. The man you love was born from the ashes of the man you hate. One doesn't exist without the other. Yara stepped back as if his touch burned. No, she said, shaking her head violently. I don't accept that. I don't accept that my love is built on the bones of my own blood. She turned to leave, but Augusto followed her, grabbing her arm in desperation. Yara, please. If there's anything between us that's worth something, give me a chance to explain. Explain what? She turned, and her eyes were red with tears and fury. Explain how you slept peacefully after destroying families. Explain how you justified chaining children to yourself. Explain how you managed to look at yourself in the mirror every morning. I couldn't, Augusto confessed, releasing her arm. That's why I stopped. That's why I changed my life. That's why I built everything I have today, to try to balance the scale of evil I did. The scale. Yara laughed again, that terrible laughter that cut deeper than any scream. Do you think money balances murder, that success compensates genocide? No, said Augusto, feeling tears burn in his own eyes. Nothing balances. Nothing compensates. I just tried to transform myself into the kind of man who might deserve forgiveness. Forgiveness from whom? From the dead. From orphaned children. From mothers who never saw their children again. Augusto couldn't answer. He stood there, in the middle of the library, surrounded by fragments of his previous life, feeling the weight of every soul he had helped destroy fall upon him like an avalanche. Yara observed him in silence for a long moment, as if trying to memorize the face of the man she had loved for so brief a time. I need to leave, she said finally, her voice now without anger, only empty as a dry well. Where to? Far away, to a place where I can forget that I once thought love could heal wounds too deep to heal. And so, while the Amazonian night witnessed the end of an impossible dream, Yara left Augusto's life, taking with her not only his heart, but also the last hope of redemption he had nourished. Alone among the documents of his past crimes, Augusto faced for the first time the true price of his actions, the loss of the only love that had given meaning to his existence. The forest screamed. 3 days had passed since Yara disappeared in the morning mist, leaving only the perfume of wild herbs impregnated in her abandoned clothes. Augusto didn't sleep, didn't eat, wandered the mansion's corridors like a ghost seeking peace he knew he would never find. And around his collapsing world, the Amazon seemed to have declared war against everything he represented. It began with the birds. Thousands of them, from species that had never been seen together, descended upon the rubber plantations like living clouds. Red macaws mixed with golden toucans, great kiskadees danced beside Wirapurus, creating a deafening symphony that made work impossible. The few rubber workers who still remained loyal to Augusto found themselves surrounded by an audience of bright eyes that watched them with disturbing intelligence. Then came the plants. Vines sprouted from the earth overnight, growing with supernatural speed to envelop equipment and barracks. Giant ferns emerged among the rows of rubber trees, reclaiming territory that had been domesticated for decades. It was as if the forest itself was rising to expel the invaders from its sacred land. But true terror began when Tupa Dorado appeared. The young chief emerged from the forest at dawn of the 4th day, not alone as Shaman White Vulture had done, but followed by 50 warriors painted for war. Their bodies were living canvases where stories of revenge were written in strokes of urucum and juniper. Spears of noble wood gleamed in the sun like promises of death, and in their eyes burned the fury of 1,000 years of oppression. "Where is the traitor?" asked Tupa when he found Augusto in the center of Manaus's main plaza, where half the city had gathered to witness the confrontation. "She left," Augusto replied, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "Left, or was transformed into a ghost by your white man's magic? She left of her own will when she discovered who I really was." Tupa studied Augusto's face like an eagle observing wounded prey. There was something in that pale man he couldn't understand, a sadness that seemed genuine, a pain that echoed his own loss. "Yara was promised to me since childhood," said the chief, his voice loaded with pain that transcended rage. "Her soul and mine were woven by the gods to form a single rope. You, man of the Stone City, cut that rope with your hands dirty with my people's blood." The accusation echoed through the plaza like a war drum. Augusto felt the weight of all gazes, from indigenous warriors who saw him as ancestral enemy, from Manaus citizens who whispered about curses and calamities, from his own rubber workers who began questioning loyalty to a boss who had attracted such fury upon their heads. "It's true," said Augusto, surprising everyone with his brutal honesty. "I cut many sacred ropes. I destroyed families, killed innocents, profaned everything you consider sacred, and now I pay the price." "The price is death," declared Tupa, raising his spear as a symbol of war. "Your death and the death of all who choose to stay by your side." It was then that Benedicto, the loyal foreman, stepped forward. "The colonel's men aren't guilty of his sins," he said, his voice firm despite visible fear. "They're simple men who work for their families." "Every man who serves a demon becomes a demon too," Tupa replied. "The forest makes no distinctions." The confrontation that followed wasn't a battle in the traditional sense, but something more subtle and terrifying. Tupa's warriors didn't attack directly. They simply spread through the region like seeds carried by wind, establishing themselves in the forest around the rubber plantations like silent sentinels. During the night, psychological attacks began. Screams echoed among the trees, not war cries but lamentations that froze the blood of men in their barracks. "They were the voices of the dead," said the rubber workers, "the souls of all murdered indigenous people who came to collect vengeance." Equipment disappeared without leaving traces. Tools were found hanging in branches 20 meters high, arranged in patterns that formed incomprehensible but clearly threatening symbols. Latex buckets dawned with the substance transformed into a reddish paste that smelled like coagulated blood. In 1 week the exodus became total. Even the rubber workers most loyal to Augusto yielded to ancestral terror that spread through the camps like spiritual epidemic. Entire families left during dawn, carrying only what they could manage, leaving behind years of work and hope. Augusto watched his empire crumble like a sandcastle touched by tide. But strangely, he felt no anger or desperation, only a melancholy acceptance that surprised him. It was as if part of him understood that such destruction was not only just, but necessary. It was on an afternoon of fine rain that she appeared. Yara emerged from the water curtain like a supernatural vision, walking down Manaus's main road toward Augusto's mansion. But she was no longer the woman he had known. There was something different in her movements, a determination that transcended personal pain and touched something deeper. She wore her tribe's traditional clothes, her body painted with symbols that Augusto recognized from documents he had obsessively studied since childhood. They were mediation marks, sacred drawings that identified those chosen by spirits to bridge conflicting worlds. "Yara," Augusto whispered when she stopped before his property's gates. "I came to offer a truce," she said, her voice carrying an authority she hadn't possessed before. "But there is a price." "Any price," Augusto replied without hesitation. "You'll have to submit to the spirit's judgment. You'll have to enter the sacred forest and face all the souls you destroyed. If you survive, if the ancestors accept your transformation, the war will end. And if I don't survive?" Yara looked into his eyes, and there he saw not only the woman he had loved, but the ancestral priestess who had awakened within her. "Then at least you'll die as a man of honor, instead of living as a coward monster." And so, while Amazonian rain washed Manaus's streets like tears of ancient gods, Augusto faced the choice that would define not only his destiny, but the destiny of two warring peoples. The man who had dedicated his life to conquering the forest would now have to surrender completely to it, in a journey that could cost him his soul, if he still had one left to lose. The new moon hid its face when the journey began, as if the very heavens conspired to plunge the world into absolute darkness. Augusto followed Yara through paths that existed only in ancestral memory, invisible roads that serpentined through the forest like pulsing veins of a living, conscious organism. They didn't speak during the first hours of walking. The silence between them was thick as mist rising from wet ground, loaded with unspoken words and broken promises. Augusto watched how Yara moved, no longer as the woman he had known, but like a force of nature that had found its true home among the green shadows. The ritual would begin in the heart of the sacred forest, in a place the Indigenous called House of Ancient Spirits, a circular clearing where trees grew in geometric patterns that defied any botanical explanation. There, according to Tikuna traditions, the dead returned to judge the living, and crimes of the past found their resolution. "Do you understand what you're about to face?" asked Yara when they reached the edge of the clearing, where ancient wooden totems rose from earth like bony fingers pointing to the starry sky. "No," Augusto admitted, observing the sculptures that seemed to observe him back with eyes of polished stone. "But I know I need to try." Yara nodded, and for the first time since they reunited, he glimpsed a flash of the tenderness he had known. "The ancestors' judgment isn't just a ritual," she explained, beginning to prepare herbs that would bring visions. "It's a journey through all the lives your actions affected. You'll see through the eyes of each person you hurt, feel on your own skin each pain you caused. And if the pain is too great to bear, then you'll die here, in this sacred place, and your soul will be trapped forever between worlds, without peace, without rest." Augusto watched her hands move with ritual precision while she mixed barks, leaves, and roots into a dark paste that exhaled a sweet, terrifying perfume. Each movement seemed choreographed by the gods themselves, each gesture loaded with power that transcended human understanding. "Why are you doing this for me?" he asked, as she drew ancestral symbols on his chest with the sacred paste. Yara stopped what she was doing, eyes meeting his in darkness dotted with fireflies. "Because I still believe that inside the monster exists a man who can be saved. And because I still love you, even though I hate everything you represented." The words cut Augusto more deeply than any blade. He closed his eyes, feeling tears burn before trickling down his face. "I don't deserve your love," he whispered. "No," Yara agreed, continuing to paint symbols on his skin. "But perhaps you deserve a chance to become someone who does." When the preparation ended, Augusto was unrecognizable, covered with symbols that told stories of death and rebirth. His urban skin transformed into ancestral parchment where spirits would write their judgment. "Drink," said Yara, offering him a gourd full of dark liquid that seemed to move with its own life. Augusto drank without hesitation, feeling the bitter taste burn his throat like liquid fire. Almost immediately the world began to deform around him. Trees became whispering giants, stars descended to dance around his head, and the earth itself began to pulse under his feet like a gigantic heart. Then the visions began. First, he saw himself through Yara's eyes, Yara's uncle. He felt the terror of being hunted like an animal, the humiliation of being chained like an object, the pain of being separated from the family he loved more than life itself. Augusto experienced every moment of that agony, from capture to the last breath of a good man who died far from home, surrounded by enemies who saw him as less than human. Then came others. Kawan, who died working in rubber plantations, dreaming every night of the daughter he had left behind. Raoni, who never got to know the first child born months after his capture. Dozens of other men, women, and children who became numbers in reports, but who now showed their true faces, their real pain, their shattered dreams. Augusto lived each death, each separation, each moment of desperation that his actions had caused. He felt bones break under forced labor, experienced fever that killed children far from their mothers, lived the madness of women who lost children and husbands in one brutal night. For hours, or perhaps days, time had lost meaning. He agonized in each body he had helped destroy. He screamed with voices that weren't his, cried tears of all orphaned mothers, felt his heart shatter into 1,000 fragments of guilt and remorse. When the visions finally ceased, Augusto lay prostrate on the clearing's ground, trembling like a leaf in the storm, covered with sweat and tears and something that might have been blood. Every fiber of his being ached, as if it had been destroyed and rebuilt. Yara knelt beside him, her hand gently touching his feverish forehead. "They speak through you now," she said, her voice full of amazement. "The ancestors. They want you to live." "Why?" Augusto groaned, barely managing to form words. "After everything, why didn't they kill me?" "Because," replied a voice that wasn't Yara's, "a dead man cannot repair the damage he caused in life." Augusto raised his clouded eyes and saw around the clearing translucent figures materializing like smoke gaining form. He recognized some faces. They were victims of his actions, the men and women he had helped kill, but who now observed him not with hatred, but with something that could be compassion. Yara was among them, and when he smiled, Augusto felt his heart reorganize within his chest. "You drank our pain," said Yara's uncle's spirit. "Now you'll carry our memory. You'll be our voice in the world of the living. You'll make our sacrifices have meaning." "How?" asked Augusto, struggling to kneel on sacred earth. "By giving our people what was always denied them: justice, dignity, home." The visions that followed were different, not of death and pain, but of possibility and hope. Augusto saw lands being returned to tribes, schools where indigenous children would learn both ancestral wisdom and that of white books, hospitals where traditional and modern medicine would work side by side. He saw himself no longer as exploiter, but as protector, using his wealth and influence to repair decades of damage, building bridges where before there had been only chasms. "But first," said Yara's voice, echoing like wind in treetops, "you must face your final judgment." Tupac Dorado's figure emerged from shadows, not as the furious young warrior who had declared war, but as the broken man who had lost the only woman he had ever loved. "She was always mine," he said, voice loaded with pain that resonated across worlds. "Promised by gods, chosen by ancestors. You stole her from me." Augusto looked at Yara, who watched the scene with tears silently running down her face. He knew this was the decisive moment, not just for him, but for all of them. "You're right," he said, rising with difficulty. "I stole her, but not from you." "From whom then?" "From herself." From the right, every woman has to choose her own destiny. And in that moment, while ancestral spirits watched and judged, Augusto made the choice that would define not only his future, but the future of two worlds that were slowly learning that true love knows no boundaries of race, culture, or tradition. Dawn arrived tinted with gold over the sacred forest, but the light filtering through ancient canopies carried somber omens. Augusto awakened from the ritual trance transformed, not only in appearance with skin still marked by ancestral symbols that seemed to pulse with their own life, but in essence. Something fundamental had changed within him during the night of judgment, as if his soul had been dismantled and rebuilt with new pieces. Yara sat a few meters away, watching him with eyes that mixed relief and apprehension. The spirits had departed with the first lights, taking with them the supernatural aura that had transformed the clearing into a portal between worlds. Now they were just two human beings, facing choices that could define the destiny of entire cultures. "They accepted you," she said, her voice loaded with amazement, as if she still couldn't believe what she had witnessed. "The ancestors, they saw something in your soul I didn't expect to find." Augusto tried to stand and felt every muscle in his body protest, as if he had carried the world's weight for an eternity. But there was something more, a clarity he had never experienced before, a deep understanding of his place in existence's great fabric. "And now," he asked, watching how sunbeams danced through leaves, creating patterns that seemed to write messages in ancestral tongue. "Now you'll have to prove the transformation is real," Yara replied, rising with the fluidity of one who had always belonged to that environment. "The spirits gave you an opportunity, but people need to see concrete change." It was then they heard the first scream. The sound echoed through the forest like a lost soul's lament coming from Manaus's direction. Then another and another, until a symphony of terror spread through the morning like sonic epidemic. "Something's happening in the city," said Yara, her expression changing from contemplative to alarmed. They ran through the forest with desperate urgency, Yara moving like a gazelle among trees, while Augusto struggled to keep up, still weakened by the previous night's ritual. When they emerged from the last rows of trees and spotted Manaus, the spectacle awaiting them was one of controlled devastation. The city was being systematically evacuated. Federal troops marched through streets in military formation, directing families from their homes with brutal efficiency. Carts loaded with belongings headed to the port, where steamboats waited to take refugees downriver. But what most shocked Augusto was seeing his own brother, Benedicto Vasconcelos, commanding operations in a military uniform he had never seen before. "Amazon Pacification Operation," read the decree that soldiers posted on city posts. "By order of the imperial government, all civilians must abandon the region due to public order disturbances caused by subversive activities." Augusto felt the world spin around him. His own brother, the man who had been his business partner, who knew every secret of his empire, had allied himself with forces that wanted to destroy him. "Benedicto!" he shouted, emerging from forest shadows. His brother turned with military precision of an experienced soldier, and Augusto realized with growing horror that perhaps he had always been exactly that. "Augusto," said Benedicto, his voice carrying a coldness he had never shown before. "You're under arrest for treason against the homeland, inciting indigenous rebellion, and crimes against national security." "What the hell is happening here?" "What should have happened long ago," Benedicto replied, signaling soldiers who approached with rifles ready. "You became a threat to established order. Your obsession with a savage brought instability to the entire region." "Savage?" Augusto's voice rose an octave, loaded with rage he didn't know he possessed. "You're talking about Yara. I'm talking about an indigenous woman who corrupted the mind of the Amazon's most powerful man," said Benedicto, adjusting military insignia on his uniform. "A man who was once my brother, but who transformed into a puppet of primitive forces." It was then that Augusto understood the magnitude of betrayal. Benedicto wasn't just his partner. He was an imperial government agent, planted in his business for years to watch and control one of Brazil's richest men. All trust, all fraternity, all complicity had been a carefully constructed lie. "Since when?" asked Augusto, feeling more betrayed than during the entire crisis with Yara. "From the beginning," Benedicto admitted, without showing any remorse. "Since you began accumulating too much power for one man. The Empire needs control, Augusto. It needs order. And you chose chaos. I chose love. You chose destruction." Yara, who had remained hidden among trees, emerged like an ancestral apparition. Her presence caused a murmur among soldiers, many of whom crossed themselves or grabbed religious talismans. "The witch," whispered one of them. "The cursed indigenous woman." "Arrest her too," ordered Benedicto, but his voice trembled slightly when Yara's eyes met his. It was then that something happened that no one expected. Yara didn't flee, didn't resist, didn't use any of the supernatural powers everyone feared. She simply surrendered, extending her hands so shackles could be placed. "Why?" Augusto whispered, as soldiers shackled her with specially forged chains, iron mixed with elements the military believed neutralized indigenous magic. "Because," she replied, looking into his eyes with serenity that transcended fear, "some battles can only be won through surrender." While they were taken to military carts under armed escort, Augusto watched his city being systematically dismantled. Houses were sealed, businesses closed, entire families deported to unknown destinations. It was as if Manaus was being erased from the map, transformed into a ghost town that would exist only in memory. "Where are they taking us?" he asked his brother during transport. "To a place where you can't cause more damage," Benedicto replied, avoiding his gaze. "To a place where this madness can be properly treated." "Madness? You call madness the first real feeling I've had in my entire life? I call madness a man who abandons family, fortune, and homeland for a woman who doesn't even belong to our race." Augusto looked at Yara, who traveled in the cart beside them, hands chained but spirit still free. Even surrounded by enemies, shackled like a criminal, she radiated a dignity that made all present feel small in comparison. "Perhaps," said Augusto, raising his voice so she could hear him, "true madness is thinking that love needs government license or society's approval." And while military carts headed toward unknown destination, carrying with them the ruins of a love that had defied all conventions, Augusto and Yara faced the possibility that they might never see freedom again. But would the Empire's power be strong enough to destroy a feeling that had resisted prejudice, ancestral traditions, and even past guilt itself? São José Fortress emerged from Solimões River waters like a monster of stone and iron, its black walls reflecting in the dark surface that ran silent as oil. Built by the Portuguese 2 centuries before to control Amazonian trade routes, it had transformed into a political prison where the Brazilian Empire buried its most delicate problems. Augusto awakened in a humid cell that smelled of mold and desperation, walls covered with inscriptions left by previous prisoners, names, dates, final words of men who had disappeared into bureaucratic darkness. Through bars of the small window, he could see endless waters that separated him from any possibility of escape. He had been separated from Yara since arrival 3 days before. He didn't know where she was, if she was alive, if she was being treated appropriately. Uncertainty corroded his mind more cruelly than any physical torture. It was on the 4th day that Benedicto came to visit. His brother now wore the complete uniform of an Imperial Army colonel, decorations shining on his chest like false stars. He walked with the authority of one who had always possessed true power, and Augusto understood that for all those years he had been just a puppet in the hands of a masterful manipulator. "How are you feeling, brother?" asked Benedicto, sitting in a chair guards had brought specially for the occasion. "Where is she?" Augusto replied, ignoring the question. "Safe, for now." "What does that mean?" Benedicto sighed like a patient teacher before a stubborn student. "It means your destiny and hers are interconnected. Cooperate with us, publicly renounce that insane passion, denounce the subversive activities she was organizing among the tribes, and perhaps we can find a civilized solution to this entire problem." "What subversive activities?" "Come on, Augusto. Do you really believe an indigenous woman banished from her own tribe appears from nowhere, seduces the Amazon's richest man, causes revolts in rubber plantations, and disappears for days in the forest by chance? She's an agent of indigenous revolt spreading across the entire frontier." "That's a lie. It's the truth the government chose to believe. And conveniently, it's the truth that justifies all necessary measures to pacify the region." Augusto felt terrible understanding form in his mind. "You were waiting for this," he said slowly. "You wanted justification to militarily intervene in the Amazon." "The region was becoming too powerful," Benedicto admitted without showing shame. "Men like you accumulating fortunes and influence that rivaled the central government itself. It was only a matter of time before you began dreaming of independence. So you approached me, pretending to be my brother. I am your brother," Benedicto cut in, and for the first time showed something that could have been genuine remorse. "But I'm also an Empire soldier, and when the two loyalties conflicted, I chose Brazil. You chose power. I chose order over chaos, civilization over barbarism, future over primitive past." Augusto rose from the straw bed where he sat, moving to cell bars like a caged animal. "And what's my future in this civilized order you're building?" "That depends on you," Benedicto replied, also standing. "Sign the confession we prepared. Publicly renounce your passion for the indigenous woman, testify against her in the military tribunal that will be organized, and you'll be transferred to a comfortable prison in Rio de Janeiro. In a few years, when the situation calms, you might even recover part of your freedom. And Yara, the indigenous woman, will be tried for subversion and treason. If you testify against her, perhaps she'll receive only life imprisonment. If not, well, The military tribunal has no limitations on the type of sentence it can apply. The veiled threat floated in the cell's humid air like toxic smoke. Augusto understood he faced the definitive choice: save his own skin by betraying the woman he loved, or remain loyal and watch her die for crimes she hadn't committed. "I need time to decide," he said finally. "You have until noon tomorrow," Benedicto replied, knocking on the door for guards to open it. "After that, events will follow their natural course." That night, alone in cell darkness, Augusto did what he hadn't done in decades. He prayed. Not to Catholic saints of his formal education, but to ancestral spirits he had encountered in the forest, to invisible forces Yara had taught him to respect. It was during this silent prayer that he heard the first whisper. "Stone City man," said a feminine voice that seemed to come from the very walls. "Why do you cry like a lost child?" Augusto raised his head, trying to locate the voice's origin. "Who's there?" "A friend you saved when others would have left to die," the voice replied, and Augusto finally recognized Yara's musical tone. She was communicating with him through ventilation ducts connecting the cells, a network of tunnels that Portuguese builders had never imagined would be used for love conversations between prisoners. "Yara, are you well? Did they do anything to you?" "I'm intact, but not for much longer. They plan something terrible for tomorrow." "I know. Benedicto offered me a deal." "What kind of deal?" Augusto hesitated, knowing the next words could be the most important of his life. "If I testify against you, pretend you're a subversive agent, maybe you'll escape death." The silence that followed was so long that Augusto began to fear she had been discovered and taken away. When she finally responded, her voice carried serenity that surprised him. "And you believe I'd want to live carrying the mark of traitor to my own people? I believe you alive means there's still hope. Dead you won't save anyone. There are things worse than death, man. I learned to love. Dishonor is one of them." "Then what do? We escape together tonight." The word impossible died on Augusto's lips when he realized he was talking to a woman who had defied millenary traditions, faced secular prejudices, and survived alone in the forest. For someone like that, perhaps there was no impossible, only different degrees of difficulty. "There's something you need to know first," Yara's voice continued. "My coming to you wasn't accidental." And while Amazonian night enveloped the fortress in its dark mantle, Augusto was about to discover that even the love he thought he knew completely harbored secrets capable of changing everything he thought he knew about destiny, revenge, and redemption. The silence following Yara's confession was dense as mist rising from the dark waters of Solimoy's river. Augusto felt the world reorganize around him, as if all certainties he had built about his relationship with her were pieces of a puzzle that had just been shattered and reassembled into a completely different image. "My tribe didn't banish me," Yara's voice continued through ventilation ducts, each word cutting the cell's humid air like a sharp blade. "They sent me, as a spy, as an assassin, as an instrument of ancestral revenge." Augusto rested his forehead against cold bars, feeling frozen iron against his feverish skin. "To kill me? To destroy you, slowly, completely, to make you fall in love and then reveal who I really was, leaving you to live with the pain of having loved your own destruction. But you didn't do it. No, because I discovered something my people didn't expect, that the monster they sent me to destroy had transformed into a man, and that I transformed from hunter to prey." Augusto closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of revelation. Everything had been planned. The accident on Rio Negro's banks, the way she had initially resisted his care, even how she had allowed him to gradually approach. It was a revenge plan so sophisticated it had taken 2 years to execute, so perfect that he had fallen in love with his own destruction without ever suspecting. "Do you hate me now?" she asked, and for the first time since they began talking, her voice trembled like a leaf in storm. "I should," Augusto replied, surprised to discover he felt no anger, only deep melancholy like artesian wells. "But I can't. All I feel is understanding. Understanding. You had every right to hate me, every right to seek revenge. If I were you, I would have done exactly the same. But I couldn't complete the mission. At the moment when I should have revealed the truth and watched you shatter, I discovered my own pain would be greater than yours. I had become human." Words echoed through dark tunnels, carrying all the weight of a transformation that had surprised even the one who experienced it. Augusto understood that Yara had paid a price perhaps even greater than his. She had betrayed not only her mission, but all her people's trust. "That's why my father came to find me," she continued. "Not because I had been banished, but because I had failed in my mission, because I had chosen love over justice. And now, what happens now? Now we have to flee, together, before both my people and yours destroy us for crimes we committed only by loving each other. How? This fortress is impenetrable. Fortress. Guards in every corridor, 20-meter walls, the river infested with caimans." "There's a passage," said Yara, and Augusto could hear hope in her voice that he didn't expect to find. "Built by the Portuguese themselves as an escape route in case of indigenous attacks. They don't know my people have known its location for 2 centuries. Where? In the Eastern Tower's foundations. There's a false stone that gives access to tunnels leading directly to the river. But, the passage is in cells destined for prisoners condemned to death. We'd have to pass through execution corridor, through torturer's tower, through dungeons where they keep the most dangerous cases." Augusto felt a bitter smile form on his lips. The irony was perfect. To reach freedom, they would have to traverse the fortress's heart of darkness. "And there's one more thing," Yara continued. "The passage can only be opened from inside. Someone would have to stay behind to allow the other to escape." "No," Augusto said immediately. "We escape together or we don't escape. You don't understand. If we're captured together, we'll both die. If one of us escapes, the other will live the rest of their life knowing they betrayed the only true love they ever had." The silence that followed was filled only by distant sound of water beating against fortress walls. Augusto could imagine Yara in her own cell, weighing possibilities, calculating odds, trying to find a solution that would save at least one of them. "There's a third option," she said finally, her voice so low he could barely hear it. "What?" "We can choose to die together, here, tonight, on our own terms." The suggestion floated in air like perfume of poisonous flowers. Beautiful, seductive, lethal. Augusto understood she was offering what many would consider the perfect solution, a romantic ending that would transform their story from scandal to epic tragedy, from crime to martyrdom. "No," he said, with firmness that surprised both. "We're not going to die. We're going to live. We're going to escape, find a place where we can be simply Augusto and Yara, without histories, without guilt, without the weight of 2 worlds trying to separate us." How? Together. In the only way that matters, together. It was then that Augusto had an idea so audacious that for a moment he doubted his own sanity. But when he examined it from all angles, he realized it might be their only chance. "What are you thinking?" asked Yara, as if she could feel his mind's gears working through stone walls. "I'm thinking," said Augusto, standing and beginning to examine every centimeter of his cell, "that maybe it's time to use some lessons I learned in rubber plantations about how to face impossible situations." "What lessons?" "That sometimes the only way out is through danger itself, that sometimes you have to dive into the storm's heart to find the eye of calm." And while dawn slowly approached, bringing with it the promise of trials and executions, Augusto and Yara began plotting the most desperate and unlikely plan 2 hearts in love had ever conceived. But would their love be strong enough to overcome not only the stone walls that imprisoned them, but also invisible walls built by centuries of hatred and prejudice? Dawn arrived loaded with somber omens. Augusto awakened to the sound of military drums resonating through fortress walls, the ritual that announced judgment and execution day. Through his cell's small window, he could see soldiers organizing in the central courtyard, building a wooden platform he knew well from descriptions he'd heard from other prisoners. It was the gallows. "Augusto!" Yara's voice reached him through ventilation ducts, more urgent than in previous conversations. "They're coming for me in an hour. The trial will be at 10 this morning." Augusto felt his heart accelerate like war drums. They had spent the night refining their escape plan, but now time had run out before they could put it into practice. "Listen carefully," Yara continued. "There's something else you need to know before it's too late." "What?" "The secret passage doesn't just lead to the river. It leads to a sacred place of my people, a grotto where elders have kept ancestral treasures for 1,000 years. If we manage to get there, we'll be under spiritual protection that not even the Brazilian army would dare violate." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because the price to enter that sacred place is complex. It requires a purification ritual that can kill us if we're not considered worthy by the spirits." Augusto closed his eyes, understanding that even escape would be a final test of his spiritual transformation. It wasn't enough to escape physically. He would have to prove again that he had become someone worthy of ancestral protection. It was then he heard heavy steps in the corridor, soldiers' voices, jingling keys, creaking ancient hinges. They were coming for her. Augusto, Yara's voice came desperate through tunnels. If something goes wrong, if I don't survive the trial, I want you to know. No, he cut in, raising his voice. We're not saying goodbye. We're going to meet again in freedom. How? Trust me. What Augusto did next defied all logic and common sense. He began to scream. Not a scream of desperation or madness, but something much more calculated. The scream of a man who had discovered information that could extremely interest military authorities. He screamed about indigenous conspiracies, about revolt plans, about secrets Yara had revealed to him during captivity. Within minutes, guards ran to his cell, followed by Benedicto himself and the fortress commander, a grey-haired colonel called Tiburcio, who was famous for discovering truths where others saw only lies. "What the hell are you screaming about?" asked Benedicto, clearly irritated at being pulled from breakfast. "She talked," said Augusto, grabbing cell bars with theatrical desperation. "All night long, she wouldn't stop talking through ventilation ducts. She confessed everything." "Confessed what?" asked Colonel Tiburcio, his small eyes gleaming with predatory interest. "The plans, connections with other tribes, weapon deposits hidden in the forest. My God, you have no idea what she really represents." The three men exchanged meaningful glances. If Augusto was telling the truth, Yara wasn't just a local subversive. She was part of a resistance network extending throughout the Amazon. "Keep talking," ordered Tiburcio. "She said the attack on my rubber plantations was just the first step of a larger plan, that there are organized cells in at least 12 different tribes, all coordinated by leaders you don't even suspect exist." "Names?" demanded Benedicto. "We want names." "She'll only talk in your presence," Augusto replied. "She said she trusts military more than civilians, that she prefers to negotiate directly with those who have real power." It was a masterfully constructed lie, but based on psychological truth Augusto knew well: military vanity. Men like Tiburcio lived for moments when they could demonstrate their superiority over civilians, especially rich civilians who didn't adequately respect military hierarchy. "Bring the prisoner to interrogation room," ordered Tiburcio. "Immediately." "But Colonel," protested a young lieutenant, "the trial is scheduled for—" "The trial can wait," Tiburcio cut off. "If she has information about a subversion network, that's absolute priority." Augusto felt a wave of relief and terror in equal proportions. He had managed to postpone Yara's execution, but now both would be in the same room, surrounded by armed soldiers, being interrogated by men who wouldn't hesitate to kill them at the first sign of deception. Half an hour later, he was escorted to a bare-walled room in the fortress basement, where Yara already waited, sitting in a wooden chair with chained hands. When their gazes met, Augusto saw in them not only love, but also immediate understanding of what he was trying to do. "Very well," said Tiburcio, adjusting his uniform with military precision. "We're here to hear your complete confession about subversive activities you organized in the region." Yara looked directly at Augusto, and when she spoke, her voice carried authority that made all present lean forward. "I didn't organize subversive activities," she said clearly. "I led them." The silence that followed was so profound that Augusto could hear his own heart beating. Yara had just confessed to being much more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "Continue," said Tiburcio, voice hoarse with excitement. "During the past 3 years, I united 15 different tribes under single leadership. We created communication networks extending from Rio Branco to Rio Madeira. We trained warriors, accumulated weapons, planned coordinated attacks that will transform the entire Amazon into free indigenous territory." "That's impossible," murmured Benedicto. "A woman, an indigenous woman, alone, couldn't organize something of that magnitude." "A woman, no," Yara agreed, rising from the chair despite shackles. "But a princess can move mountains." And then she told them who she really was. Daughter of shaman White Vulture, but not just daughter. Heir to a royal lineage dating back to the first chiefs who had resisted Portuguese invasion. Educated from childhood to be a leader, speaking 7 indigenous languages besides Portuguese, French, and English. Trained in medicine, diplomacy, military strategy and all arts a future queen would need to master. The banishment was theatre, she confessed, her eyes shining with ancestral pride. A way to allow me to move freely among whites, study their weak points, identify those who could be converted to our cause. Augusto felt the world spin around him. Everything had been theatre, not just her personal revenge mission, but a military espionage operation on epic scale. He had fallen in love not with a rejected indigenous woman, but with a revolutionary leader planning to overthrow the entire Amazonian colonial system. "And me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "What was my role in all this?" Yara looked at him with an expression that mixed love and sadness in heartbreaking proportions. "You were the central piece," she said, "the region's most powerful man. If we managed to convert you, or destroy you, all white resistance in the Amazon would crumble. But you fell in love with me." "Yes," she confessed, tears beginning to flow down her face. "And that was my greatest mistake, and my greatest victory." And so, in the cold interrogation room of the Amazon's most feared fortress, Augusto discovered that the love of his life was simultaneously his salvation and destruction, his redemption and ruin. But one final question remained, the most important of all. What could a warrior princess and a repentant ex-exploiter do when two entire worlds conspired to separate them forever? Truth resonated through the interrogation room like thunder in clear sky, leaving all present paralyzed before the magnitude of revelation. Yara wasn't just a prisoner. She was the epicenter of a revolution that could redefine the Amazon's political map forever. Colonel Tiburcio was first to recover from shock, his military mind immediately calculating the situation's strategic implications. "If what she says is true," he murmured, "we face the greatest threat to national sovereignty since the Paraguay War." "It's true," Yara confirmed, raising her chin with royal pride, "and there's no military force in Brazil capable of stopping what has already been set in motion." "We'll see about that," Tiburcio replied, signaling guards. "Lock her in North Tower. Total isolation. No communication with outside world." It was then that Augusto did something that surprised even Yara. "Colonel," he said, rising slowly, "may I suggest an alternative?" "What alternative?" "One that avoids the bloodbath about to sweep across the entire Amazon." Tiburcio laughed bitterly. "You think you have authority to negotiate with us? You're just a traitor in love with a terrorist." "I'm a man who knows this region better than any general from Rio de Janeiro," Augusto replied, finding inner strength he didn't know he possessed. "I know every river, every trail, every hideout where you'll never find rebels. And she," he pointed to Yara, "knows every thought, every plan, every movement they'll make in coming months." "Keep talking," said Benedicto, realizing where his brother was heading. "Together we can offer something none of you could achieve alone. True peace. Not peace of military conquest, which would last only until the next generation, but peace of mutual understanding." Yara watched the discussion like a spectator of a theatrical play, where her destiny was being decided by others. When she finally spoke, her voice carried serenity that transcended the situation. "There are conditions," she said. "What conditions?" asked Tiburcio. "First, autonomous territory for my people, with their own government and laws under federal protection but not federal administration. Second, mandatory bilingual education throughout the region, preserving both indigenous and Brazilian culture. Third, indigenous participation in all decisions affecting their territories." "That's impossible," protested Benedicto. "The government would never accept such autonomy." "The government will accept," Tiburcio said slowly, "because the alternative is a war that could last decades and cost fortunes the country doesn't have." Negotiations that followed lasted 3 days and nights. Telegrams flew between fortress and empire capital, carrying proposals, counter-proposals, and veiled threats from all sides. Politicians met in secret sessions, generals consulted maps and strategies, diplomats calculated costs and benefits. Throughout this time, Augusto and Yara remained prisoners, but special prisoners, no longer criminals, but valuable pieces in an epic political game. "Do you understand what this means?" asked Yara on one of the few occasions they were authorized to talk. "We'll never be just Augusto and Yara. We'll be symbols, representatives, ambassadors of different worlds for the rest of our lives." "I understand," Augusto replied, "and I accept." "Why?" "Because I prefer to be a symbol of hope by your side than a free man far from you." The answer came on the 4th day's morning, brought by a special messenger from Rio de Janeiro. Dom Pedro II himself had approved the proposal, impressed by the solution's originality and economic possibilities it represented. The marriage would be performed in Manaus, in a ceremony uniting Catholic and indigenous traditions. Augusto would donate half his lands to create the first indigenous territory officially recognized by empire. Yara would renounce any military activity against Brazil, channeling her efforts toward peaceful administration and cultural development. 5 months later, in Manaus Cathedral, they married before an audience including Brazilian authorities and indigenous leaders from throughout the Amazon. Yara wore a white silk dress embroidered with ancestral symbols in golden thread, while Augusto displayed on his chest not only Brazilian decorations but also ceremonial necklaces, symbolizing his acceptance by tribes. The kiss that sealed their union was witnessed by two worlds, slowly learning to respect each other. 10 years later, while watching his 3 children play in the mansion garden, mixed-race children who spoke Portuguese, Ticuna, and English with equal fluency, Augusto reflected on the impossible journey that had brought him there. Yara approached, now with partially grey hair but eyes that maintained all ancestral fire. In her hands, she carried a letter that had just arrived from London. "What news?" he asked. "Cambridge University wants to establish an Amazonian studies program in our territory. Real studies, not disguised exploitation." Augusto smiled, watching the youngest child, a 5-year-old girl, teaching traditional medicine techniques to a French porcelain doll. "What do you think?" asked Yara. "I think," said Augusto, wrapping her in his arms, "our story is just beginning." And there, on the terrace that had once witnessed a rich but empty man's loneliness, 2 worlds continued learning that true love doesn't just transcend barriers, it transforms them into bridges. The setting sun over the Amazon-painted sky with colors belonging to no specific culture, but to all humanity. And 2 souls who had dared love against all odds discovered that sometimes happy endings are possible, not because the world changes overnight, but because 2 hearts decide to change the world, one gesture at a time.